The scream came from the ridge above the creek, sharp and desperate, and Margaret Doyle dropped the basket of herbs she was carrying and ran toward it without a single thought for her own safety. She had lived at the edge of the Coulter Woods for 11 years, long enough to know every sound that belonged to that forest, and every sound that did not. This sound did not belong. It was thin and broken, the kind of cry an animal makes when it believes no one is coming to help it. Margaret was 61 years old, a retired veterinarian who had spent 3 decades treating farm animals across the valley before she gave it up to live alone with her books, her garden, and the quiet company of trees. Her hands, though older now, still remembered exactly what to do when something was hurt. She pushed through a wall of wet ferns, ignored the branches that scratched her arms, and stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine where the sound had turned into something worse: silence. Then she saw it. A young wolf, barely more than a pup, lying on its side near the water, one back leg twisted at a wrong angle, caught in the rusted teeth of an old steel trap someone had left buried in the leaves years ago and forgotten. Blood had darkened the fur around the joint. The animal's eyes were open, wide and glassy, fixed on her with a mixture of fear and something close to surrender. Margaret knew 2 things immediately. The first was that this trap had likely been there since before she moved to the valley, an old relic from a rancher long since gone, the kind of forgotten danger that waits in the ground for years before it finds a victim. The second was that if she did not act in the next few minutes, this animal would not survive the hour. She did not think about the fact that wolves were dangerous, that packs did not take kindly to strangers touching their young, that she was a woman, alone in the deep woods, with no phone signal, and no one who knew where she had gone. She thought only of the leg, and the blood, and the small chest rising and falling too fast. "Easy," she whispered, lowering herself slowly onto her knees a few feet away. "I am not going to hurt you. I promise you that." The pup let out a low, trembling growl, more warning than threat, the sound of a creature too weak and too frightened to truly defend itself. Margaret had heard that sound before, in barns and stables, from animals in far worse condition than this one looked. She had learned, over 30 years, that fear speaks louder than anger, and that the way through fear was patience, not force. She stayed there without moving for almost 10 minutes, speaking softly the entire time, letting her voice become familiar before she let her hands become familiar too. When the pup's growl finally faded into exhausted panting, she reached into the bag she always carried on her walks, the one with bandages and antiseptic she kept out of old habit, the habit of a woman who had spent her whole life ready to save something. The trap was old and stiff, its spring rusted nearly solid, but Margaret had strong hands, and had opened worse traps before, on cattle who had wandered into places they should not have gone. She worked the metal apart slowly, murmuring the entire time, watching the pup's eyes rather than its teeth, because eyes told her far more about whether an animal was about to bite than teeth ever did. When the trap finally gave way with a groan of old metal, the pup did not run. It could not run. It simply lay there, breathing hard, watching this stranger who smelled of soap and garden soil, and something that was not a threat. Margaret carried it back to her cabin herself, wrapped in her own jacket, feeling the small heartbeat against her forearm, the entire walk home. It weighed almost nothing. She thought, more than once during that walk, about how close she had come to simply hearing the scream and walking the other way, the way most people would have. She thought about how many decisions in a life come down to a single moment, a single choice to move toward the sound instead of away from it. Her cabin sat at the very edge of where the trees gave way to open land, close enough to the forest that deer sometimes wandered into her garden at dawn, far enough from town that her nearest neighbor was a mile down the gravel road. It was a simple place, built of dark wood and a tin roof that sang loudly whenever it rained, with a single main room that served as kitchen, workshop, and living space all at once. In the corner of that room sat the same steel table she had once used for treating farm animals, now dusty with disuse, and it was onto that table she gently laid the injured pup. The examination took over an hour. The leg was not broken, which surprised her, though the muscle and skin around the joint had been badly torn by the trap's teeth. There was a real risk of infection, and worse, but nothing that could not be managed with the supplies she still kept from her working years. She cleaned the wound carefully, working with the same calm precision she had used 1,000 times before, talking the entire time in a low, even voice, the way she used to talk to spooked horses, The pup did not fight her. Whether from exhaustion or something closer to trust, it lay still under her hands and let her work, its dark eyes following her face the entire time. "You are a lucky one," she told it, wrapping the leg in clean gauze. "Most creatures who get caught in those old traps never make another sound at all." By the time she finished, night had fallen completely, and Margaret realized with some surprise that she had not eaten anything since breakfast, that her back ached from bending over the table for so long, and that she felt more alive than she had in months. She made a bed for the pup out of an old blanket near the wood stove, sat down beside it, and did not go to her own bed until well past midnight, unwilling to leave the small creature alone in an unfamiliar place while it slept. She did not know, in that first night, that this single act of kindness toward one frightened animal would quietly reshape the next 10 years of her life. She did not know that somewhere out in the dark trees beyond her cabin, larger shapes were already moving, already searching, already circling closer to the place where the scent of their missing pup had suddenly, strangely, stopped. For 3 days, Margaret kept the pup inside her cabin, feeding it small amounts of broth and soft food, changing its bandages twice a day, watching carefully for any sign of fever that would mean the wound had turned bad beneath the surface. It never came. The pup grew stronger with each passing day, standing first on shaking legs, then walking with a careful limp across the wooden floor, sniffing at every corner of the strange new world it found itself in. Margaret found herself talking to it constantly, the way lonely people often talk to animals, filling the silence of her cabin with stories about her old work, about the farms she used to visit, about the husband she had lost to illness many years before, and the life they had built together before he was gone. The pup listened, or seemed to, tilting its head at the sound of her voice, its ears turning toward her whenever she spoke. On the 4th morning, she opened her door to let in the fresh air, and found 3 sets of large paw prints in the soft dirt, just beyond her porch steps, prints far too large to belong to the pup inside, and prints that had not been there the day before. Her heart caught in her chest. She stood very still in the doorway, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, except shadows and morning mist, curling low over the grass. Still, the message was clear enough. Something out there knew exactly where its missing pup had gone. She thought about what to do. She could keep the pup longer, wait until it healed completely, take every precaution before letting it anywhere near the forest again. Or she could trust that a mother, or a father, or whatever creature had left those tracks, was already searching every inch of the woods for a scent it recognized, and that the sooner the pup returned to familiar ground, the sooner that searching would end. She chose to trust the forest. That evening, with the pup's leg healed enough to bear weight safely, though still wrapped for protection, Margaret carried it to the very edge of the tree line behind her cabin and set it down gently in the grass. For a long moment, the pup did not move. It looked back at her, and Margaret would spend years afterward wondering whether that look had meant anything at all, or whether she had simply wanted it to. Then, without any sound, the pup turned and limped into the trees, moving faster with each step, until the shadows swallowed it completely, and the forest was silent again. Margaret stood there long after it disappeared, listening to nothing but wind moving through leaves, feeling an emptiness she had not expected. She told herself it was simply the quiet of her cabin, returning to normal after 4 days of company. She told herself that this was how it was supposed to end. A wild thing healed and returned to where it belonged. A clean and simple story with a good ending. She did not yet understand that the story had only just begun. 2 weeks later, on a cool morning heavy with fog, Margaret carried her coffee out onto the porch, the way she did every morning, and felt the hair on the back of her neck rise before she consciously understood why. Standing at the far edge of her garden, half hidden by the mist, was a wolf, unlike any she had ever seen. It was larger than the pup by a considerable measure. Its coat, a deep silver gray, streaked with darker patches along its back. Its posture calm and unhurried, in a way that felt deliberate, rather than accidental. It was not hunting. It was not afraid. It was simply standing there, watching her cabin, with an intelligence in its eyes that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. She recognized, somehow, without being told, that this was no ordinary wolf. There was something in the way it held itself, the stillness of its stance, the quiet authority radiating from its posture, that told her instantly this animal was not a follower, but a leader. This was the one the others answered to. This was the alpha. Neither of them moved for what felt like a very long time. Margaret's coffee grew cold in her hands. The wolf's eyes never left her face, and she found herself holding perfectly still, the same way she had held still beside the injured pup weeks before, understanding instinctively that any sudden movement would break whatever fragile moment was happening between them. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and walked back into the fog, unhurried, its silver form fading into gray, until she could no longer tell where the mist ended and the animal began. Margaret set her coffee down on the porch railing, with a shaking hand. She did not know, in that moment, that this would be the first of many silent visits. She did not know that this large silver wolf, the leader of a pack she had never seen in full, would return to the edge of her land again and again over the coming years, always at a distance, always watching, never approaching close enough to be touched, and never once making a sound that could be called friendly. She only knew, standing there in the cold morning air, with her heart still racing, that something had shifted in the world around her cabin, that the forest she had lived beside, peacefully for over a decade, now held eyes that watched her, and a debt that had not yet been decided, and a story that was only just beginning to write itself. She went inside, locked her door out of old habit, though she knew it would not matter to a creature like that, and sat by her window for the rest of the morning, watching the tree line, waiting to see if the silver wolf would return. It did not that day. But 3 days later, she found a dead rabbit laid neatly on her porch step, untouched, placed there, with what seemed like deliberate care rather than accident. Margaret stared at it for a long time before she understood, or thought she understood, what it meant. It was not a threat, it was not carelessness. It was, in whatever language existed between a woman and a wolf who had once saved its child, something that looked remarkably like a gift. Margaret Doyle did not know it yet, standing on her porch in the pale morning light with a dead rabbit at her feet, but she had just received the first message, in a conversation that would last for the next 10 years of her life. A conversation without words, built entirely on trust, distance, and the quiet debt an animal never forgets. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself changed in small, quiet ways she could not fully explain. She woke earlier than usual, drawn to her window before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, scanning the tree line out of habit before she had even poured her first cup of coffee. She caught herself listening more closely to the sounds of the forest at night, distinguishing the call of an owl from the rustle of deer, the wind in the pines from something heavier moving beneath them. She had lived beside these woods for 11 years, and had never once felt watched. Now she felt it constantly, and strangely, she did not mind. She thought often about the silver wolf, turning the memory over in her mind the way one turns over a smooth stone found on a riverbank, examining it from every angle. She had spent her career around animals, had learned to read fear and aggression and pain in 1,000 different postures, and nothing in that wolf's stance had suggested either fear or aggression. It had simply watched her, the way one watches something worth remembering. Margaret decided, after much thought, that she would not go looking for the pack. She understood, with the instinct built from decades of working with wild and frightened creatures, that trust could not be chased. It had to be allowed to come on its own terms, in its own time, or it would never come at all. So instead of walking into the woods with questions she had no right to ask, she simply continued her days as she always had, tending her garden, reading by the fire in the evenings, walking the same paths she had always walked, and waiting to see what, if anything, would happen next. She did not have to wait long. Nearly a month after the silver wolf's first appearance, Margaret woke to the sound of her chickens making a great deal of noise in their coop near the garden. She hurried outside, expecting perhaps a fox or a raccoon, and found instead a young wolf, thinner than she remembered, standing near the fence line with a deep gash along its shoulder, clearly caused by something sharp, perhaps a fall or a fight with a rival animal. It was not the same pup she had treated before. This one was older, though still young by the standards of a full-grown wolf, and it watched her approach with a wariness that suggested it had heard stories about her, though of course that was not possible in any way she understood. Wolves did not tell stories to each other, not the way humans did, and yet something about the way it held its ground, neither fleeing nor threatening, told her that whatever had brought it to her fence line had not been an accident. She moved slowly, the way she always did, speaking in the same low and steady voice she had used before. The young wolf allowed her closer than she expected, close enough to see that the wound, while painful, was not life-threatening if properly cleaned and treated. She retrieved her supplies from the cabin, moving carefully so as not to startle it, and treated the wound right there in the open air, kneeling in the wet grass while the animal stood remarkably still, its breathing quick but its body otherwise calm. When she finished, the young wolf did not linger. It turned and moved swiftly back toward the tree line, disappearing within seconds, leaving Margaret kneeling alone in her yard, with bloodied gauze in her hands, and a growing sense that something far larger than a single act of kindness was beginning to take shape around her. Over the following weeks, it happened again, and then again. A wolf would appear at the edge of her land, sometimes limping, sometimes carrying a wound along its side, or a swollen paw from what looked like a thorn, or a trap similar to the one that had caught the very first pup. Each time, the animal would wait at a careful distance, watching her cabin until she noticed it, and each time, Margaret would approach slowly, treat what she could, and watch the wolf disappear back into the trees the moment its wound was tended. She began to understand, though it took her some time to fully accept the idea, that she was being tested, and that she was passing whatever test was being given. The pack, whoever and however many they were, had somehow decided that her cabin at the edge of the Coulter Woods was a place of safety, a place where injury could be brought and treated without fear of harm in return. It was an extraordinary thought, and one that filled her with a mixture of wonder and quiet unease. She thought about contacting the wildlife authorities, about reporting what was happening, but something held her back each time she considered it. She worried, not without reason, that officials would see this pattern differently than she did. They might view an unusually tame pack of wolves as a danger rather than a marvel, might decide to relocate them, or worse, might see her unusual bond with these animals as something to be shut down rather than understood. She decided, in the end, to keep her own counsel, to continue what she had started quietly, without fanfare, and to let the forest keep its secrets a little while longer. She began setting aside supplies specifically for this purpose, ordering extra bandages and antiseptic on her occasional trips into town, telling the pharmacist a story about a hobby farm and animals that seemed to always find trouble. It was not entirely a lie. She simply left out the part about which animals, exactly, kept finding their way to her door. By the time the first frost of that year settled over the valley, Margaret Doyle had treated 4 different wolves, from what she now believed was a single pack, living somewhere deep within the Coulter Woods. She had seen the silver alpha only once more since that first foggy morning, standing at the same distant edge of her garden, watching in silence for a few long minutes, before disappearing again without a sound. She did not know how large the pack truly was. She did not know where they denned, or how many pups the silver alpha and its mate might be raising each year, or what dangers they faced, beyond the traps and thorns that occasionally brought a wounded animal to her door. She knew only that something rare and fragile had begun between her and these wild creatures, something built not on words or understanding in any way she could explain to another person, but on patience, on gentleness, and on the simple fact that she had chosen, on one ordinary afternoon, to run toward a sound of pain instead of walking away from it. As winter closed in around the cabin, and the first snow began to dust the tops of the pines, Margaret sat by her fire one evening and found herself smiling for reasons she could not entirely explain. She thought of the silver wolf's steady gaze, of the young ones who came limping to her fence line and left healed, of the quiet debt that seemed to exist now between her small cabin and the pack hidden somewhere in the trees beyond it. She did not know, sitting there in the warm firelight with snow beginning to fall outside her window, that this was only the very beginning of a bond that would stretch across 10 long years, through hardship and silence and doubt, before it finally came full circle, in a way she could never have predicted on that first afternoon, when she heard a scream from the ridge above the creek and ran toward it without a single thought for herself. By the time spring returned to the valley, Margaret Doyle had stopped waiting for the wolves to come to her fence line and started leaving something for them instead. It began almost by accident. She had grown tired of the tense standoffs that happened each time an injured wolf appeared near her chickens, the careful approach, the held breath, the risk that one day a wound would be too severe, or an animal too frightened to allow her close enough to help. So on a cold morning in early April, She carried a small wooden crate to a flat gray rock near the tree line, the same rock where she had first seen the silver alpha standing in the fog months before, and she filled it with clean bandages, a jar of antiseptic salve, and a strip of dried meat. She did not know if it would work. She did not know if a wild animal could understand the purpose of a box left at the edge of its territory, or if it would simply ignore the strange human object, or worse, avoid the area entirely out of caution. But something told her to try, some instinct built from years of watching animals solve problems in ways people rarely gave them credit for. 3 days later, the crate was empty, and the meat was gone. Margaret refilled it the following week, and again it was found and emptied by the time she checked. She began to understand, slowly and with a growing sense of wonder, that the wolves had learned the rhythm of this place, had learned that the flat gray rock near the tree line held things that eased pain and healed wounds, and had begun to trust it the way they had once learned to trust her hands directly. She kept the crate stocked through that entire spring, restocking it every few days, sometimes finding small signs that told her more than words ever could. A patch of fur caught on the crate's rough edge, faint drops of blood on the grass nearby, old and dried, evidence that a wound had been tended there before the animal moved on. Once, she found the crate tipped onto its side, its contents scattered but clearly used, and she spent an anxious afternoon wondering whether that meant a fight had broken out over the supplies inside, or whether it was simply the clumsy work of a young wolf still learning how the world worked. She never saw them take the supplies directly, not once. In all the months that followed, she never caught so much as a glimpse of a wolf approaching the rock while she watched from her porch. It was as though they had learned, with an intelligence that continued to astonish her, that the safest time to visit was when no eyes were on them, that trust did not mean comfort with being seen, only comfort with knowing the help would be there. Margaret found a strange peace in this arrangement. She did not need to see them to know they were there. She had spent her working life needing proof, needing to examine a wound with her own hands before she believed it existed, and yet here, in this strange and quiet partnership with a pack of wild animals she barely understood, she found herself content simply to trust the evidence left behind. The empty crate, the faint blood, the patch of fur, these were enough. By midsummer, her trips into town had become a regular part of her routine, though she kept the true purpose of her purchases carefully vague. She bought bandages in bulk from the pharmacy, telling the pharmacist, a kind woman named Louise Caro, who had known Margaret for years, that her old farm dog had taken up a habit of injuring himself in the brush behind her cabin. Louise, who had no reason to doubt her, simply smiled and rang up the purchases, occasionally asking after the dog's health with genuine concern that Margaret found herself feeling faintly guilty about. She told herself the lie was harmless, a small kindness to spare her friend confusion over something too strange to explain in a few minutes across a pharmacy counter. She did not yet understand how long that small lie would need to last. The costs began to add up faster than she expected. Antiseptic salve, proper veterinary bandages, occasional antibiotics when a wound looked deep enough to risk infection, all of it drawn from her modest retirement savings, money she had once imagined spending on small comforts in her later years, a trip somewhere warm perhaps, or simple repairs to her aging cabin roof. Instead, month after month, it went into a wooden crate at the edge of the forest, given freely to animals who would never know her name, who would never thank her in any language she could understand, who might, for all she knew, forget she existed the moment their wounds healed and they returned to the business of surviving in the wild. She did not mind, not truly. There was something in the giving itself that felt necessary to her, a way of using the skills she had spent her whole life building for something that mattered, even if no one but the wind and the trees ever witnessed it. She had spent 30 years healing animals whose owners paid her fees and thanked her with kind words and occasional gifts. This felt different, purer somehow, healing, given without any expectation of return, given simply because the need existed and she had the means to fill it. Still, there were quiet moments, usually late at night when the cabin was silent and the fire had burned low, when Margaret allowed herself to wonder whether any of it truly mattered to the animals receiving it. Wolves were not sentimental creatures, she reminded herself. They did not keep records of debts owed or kindness given. Whatever bond she imagined existed between her cabin and the pack in the woods might simply be a comfortable story she had built for herself, a way of turning ordinary animal behavior, opportunistic use of an easy food and medicine source, into something that felt like connection, because connection was what she, in her solitary life, secretly craved. She never saw the silver alpha again that entire summer, not once, though she often stood at her window at dusk, watching the tree line, half hoping for the sight of that broad gray shape standing at the edge of her garden the way it had months before. It did not come. Only the crate, refilled and emptied in an endless quiet rhythm, told her that the pack still remembered her cabin existed at all. Autumn brought its own small proof. A young female wolf, thinner than the others Margaret had treated, appeared one gray afternoon near the crate, not injured this time, but clearly pregnant, her belly heavy and low, as she moved carefully through the tall grass. Margaret watched from her porch, careful not to move, careful not to breathe too loudly, as the young wolf sniffed cautiously at the crate, before taking a strip of dried meat and retreating slowly back toward the trees. It was the first time Margaret had witnessed one of the wolves actually approach the rock in daylight, in full view, without the cover of darkness or the excuse of injury. She would think about that moment often in the years that followed, wondering whether it had meant something significant, a sign of trust deepening, or whether it had simply been an accident of timing, a hungry animal too close to giving birth to worry as much about caution as it normally would. Whatever the reason, Margaret found herself deeply moved by the sight, and that evening, she added something new to the crate for the first time, a small portion of the good beef stew she had made for her own dinner, still warm, wrapped carefully in cloth. It was not necessary. It was not sensible, by any measure a scientist or a wildlife official might apply, but Margaret had stopped, somewhere in that long, strange year, thinking purely in terms of what was necessary or sensible when it came to the pack she had never officially met, but had somehow, without ever intending to, adopted as a quiet and permanent part of her life. Winter arrived early that year, harsher than the one before it, burying the valley under snow that made the walk to the flat gray rock a genuine effort each time Margaret made the trip. She did not miss a single week. She trudged through drifts that came up past her knees, her breath forming clouds in the freezing air, her old joints aching with a cold that seemed to settle deeper into her bones each year. And still she carried the crate's supplies to the rock without fail, because somewhere out in that white and silent forest, she believed, with a certainty she could not entirely explain to herself, that a pack of wolves was depending on her. She had no proof they were depending on anything. She had only the empty crate, the fading tracks in the snow, and a feeling in her chest that had grown, over the course of a single year, from curiosity into something that felt very much like devotion. She did not know, standing alone in the snow beside that gray rock on the shortest day of that winter, that this devotion had only just begun, and that it would carry her through 9 more years of silence, doubt, and quiet faithful giving, before she would ever again stand face to face with the wolf who had started it all. Spring came again eventually, as it always did, melting the snow into rushing streams that fed the creek where Margaret had first heard that desperate cry so many months before. With the thaw came new visitors to the flat gray rock, and Margaret began to notice something that filled her with quiet astonishment. There were more of them now. Where once she had recognized perhaps 4 or 5 distinct wolves through their wounds and markings, she began to see signs of others, smaller tracks belonging to pups born over the winter, evidence of a pack that was not just surviving but growing. She thought of the pregnant female she had seen the previous autumn, and wondered, with a warmth she had not expected to feel over an animal she barely knew, whether those new small tracks belonged to pups that female had carried. She would never know for certain. There was no way to ask, no way to receive an answer even if she could, but she liked to imagine it was true, that somewhere in the den hidden deep within the Coulter woods, new life had begun that spring, life that existed at all, in part because of dried meat and clean bandages, left faithfully on a gray rock through the worst of a hard winter. Her neighbor, a farmer named Walter Higgins who lived 2 miles down the gravel road and had known Margaret since she first moved to the valley, began to notice the pattern of her disappearances into the woods, the regularity of her trips to town for medical supplies she no longer used in any veterinary practice. He mentioned it to her once, over coffee at her kitchen table, in the careful and roundabout way that people in small communities often broach subjects they suspect might be delicate. "You still keeping busy out there in those woods?" he said. Not quite a question, watching her over the rim of his mug. Margaret had considered, more than once, what she might say if anyone asked her directly. She chose, in that moment, something close to the truth, though not the whole of it. "There's an old pack living out there," she told him. "I help them from time to time." Nothing more than that. Walter's eyebrows rose, and for a moment, Margaret worried he might press further, might ask questions she was not ready to answer honestly. But instead, he simply shook his head slowly and let out a low laugh that held more affection than doubt. "Only you, Margaret," he said. "Only you would go and make friends with a pack of wolves and call it nothing more than that." She did not correct him, though the word friends felt both too large and too small for what had actually grown between her cabin and the pack in the trees. It was not friendship in any way she could easily explain, not the mutual, spoken understanding that word usually implied. It was something quieter, something built entirely from one side giving, and the other side simply receiving. No words exchanged, no gestures of affection returned, only the empty crate and the healed wounds standing as the only evidence that any of it mattered at all. As that second year drew to a close, Margaret found herself, for the first time, beginning to wonder how long she could keep this going. Her savings had shrunk more than she liked to admit. Her knees ached more sharply with each trip through the snow. She was not a young woman, and the walk to the Grey Rock, once a pleasant afternoon stroll, had become, especially in the harshest months, something that tested the limits of her strength and stamina. Still, when she stood at her window each evening and watched the tree line fade into darkness, she never once seriously considered stopping. Whatever this strange, one-sided devotion had cost her, it had given her something back that she could not easily name, a sense of purpose she had not felt since the last years of her veterinary practice, a reminder that even in a life lived largely alone, at the edge of a quiet forest, she still had something valuable to give to the world, even if the world she gave it to would never once say her name. That winter, on a bitterly cold night when the wind howled loud enough to rattle her windows, Margaret woke to a sound she had never heard before, a long, rising howl that seemed to come from very close to her cabin, followed by an answering chorus from somewhere deeper in the trees. She lay still in her bed, listening, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from something closer to wonder. She had heard wolves howl before, distant and faint, the ordinary music of the forest at night. This was different. This felt directed, deliberate, as though the pack was speaking not only to each other but announcing something to the valley itself. And Margaret, lying awake in the dark with the wind pressing against her walls, allowed herself to believe, just for that one night, that some small part of that howling was meant for her. She rose before dawn the next morning and walked to the Grey Rock through fresh snow, untouched by any footprint but her own. The crate sat exactly as she had left it, empty, and beside it, pressed carefully into the snow, was a single perfect paw print, larger than any she had seen from the younger wolves, its edges sharp and unmistakable. Margaret knelt beside it for a long time, tracing its outline with her gloved finger, understanding, without needing to be told, that the silver alpha had returned to that rock at least once, during the long months of its absence, close enough to leave this mark, close enough, perhaps, to have stood there watching her cabin, the way it had on that very first foggy morning, nearly 2 years before. She carried that memory with her through the rest of that winter, and into the years that followed, a quiet certainty that whatever bond had begun between them was still alive, still watched over, even when the silver wolf itself remained hidden, and even when the only proof she had of its presence was a single print, pressed carefully into fresh snow. The fire alarm inside Margaret Doyle's chest went off long before any actual danger appeared, a cold certainty settling into her stomach the moment she noticed the crate at the Grey Rock had not been touched in over 2 weeks. By the 3rd year of this strange arrangement, Margaret had come to know the rhythm of the pack the way she once knew the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Supplies vanished within 3 or 4 days, sometimes sooner if a wound needed urgent attention. A gap of 2 weeks was not simply unusual. It was alarming. She began walking to the rock daily instead of every few days, scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of movement, any track in the mud, or the melting patches of late snow that might tell her something had changed. She found nothing. No tracks. No scent markers along the usual trees. No distant howls at dusk. the sound that had become such a familiar part of her evenings that its absence felt like a held breath that would not release. Walter Higgins noticed the change in her before she said a word about it. He found her one afternoon standing at the edge of her property, staring into the trees, with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something between fear and grief, and he set down the tools he had brought to help repair her fence, and simply stood beside her in silence for a while before speaking. "They stopped coming," Margaret finally said, not looking away from the trees. "Could be a lot of reasons for that," Walter said gently. "Wolves move their territory sometimes. Prey gets scarce in one place, they follow it somewhere else." "I know," Margaret said. "I know that's probably all it is." But she did not believe her own words, not entirely, and Walter could hear it in her voice. He had known Margaret long enough to understand that whatever had grown between her and that hidden pack over the past 3 years had become something far more important to her than a simple hobby or a passing curiosity. He did not fully understand it himself, could not imagine feeling such devotion to animals he had never even properly seen, but he respected it enough not to argue with the fear now written plainly across her face. The following weeks brought no answers. Margaret continued restocking the crate out of habit more than expectation, watching each time as the supplies sat untouched, gathering a fine layer of dust and pollen from the trees above. She began to imagine terrible possibilities, a hunting party passing through, careless or deliberately cruel, thinning the pack down to nothing. A disease sweeping through, the kind that could move fast and silent through a group of animals living in close quarters, leaving no survivors to return to the rock and claim their medicine. Starvation, if the deer population had thinned that year, forcing the pack to travel far beyond their usual range in search of food, perhaps too far ever to find their way back. She drove into town more often that spring than she had in years, not for medical supplies this time, but simply because she could not bear the silence of her cabin, the empty tree line visible from every window. She spoke with the local wildlife office once, carefully, without revealing the true depth of her involvement, asking only whether there had been any reports of unusual wolf activity in the Coulter Woods that season. The young ranger who answered her call knew nothing specific, only that wolf populations across the region fluctuated naturally from year to year, and that a pack moving out of a familiar territory was, as Walter had said, not unusual at all. It was not enough to comfort her. Margaret found herself, for the first time since that very first afternoon 3 years before, doubting whether any of it had ever been real in the way she believed. Perhaps she had built an elaborate story around ordinary animal behavior, opportunistic creatures using an easy source of food and supplies for as long as it was convenient, only to abandon it the moment something better came along. Perhaps the Silver Alpha's careful, watchful presence had meant nothing more than a predator assessing a potential threat, and perhaps the empty crate over these past weeks was simply proof that the pack had never needed her at all, had simply found her useful for a while, and then moved on without a second thought. These doubts settled over her like the last stubborn frost of a late spring, refusing to melt no matter how much she wished them gone. She stopped restocking the crate as often, the effort feeling suddenly pointless, a ritual performed for an audience that had already left the theater. She spent more evenings simply sitting by her fire, without the familiar comfort of listening for distant howls, because there were no howls left to listen for. It was during this quiet, uncertain stretch that Margaret received a visit she had not expected. Louise Caro, the pharmacist who had sold her bandages and antiseptic for 3 years, without ever fully understanding their true purpose, drove out to the cabin one Sunday afternoon, under the pretense of checking on an old friend she had not seen in town for some time. The two women sat on Margaret's porch with tea going cold between them, and it was there, prompted by nothing more than the quiet openness that sometimes comes from long friendship, that Margaret finally told Louise the whole truth. She expected disbelief, or worse, concern that her isolation had led her toward some kind of delusion. Instead, Louise listened without interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from surprise into something gentler, something that looked very much like understanding. "You know," Louise said finally, "my grandmother used to say that the things worth doing in this world are rarely the things anyone thanks you for. She spent 40 years nursing sick children in a town with no doctor, and half of them grew up and moved away without ever sending so much as a letter back." "Did that bother her?" Margaret asked. Louise considered the question carefully before answering. "I think it did, sometimes. But she told me once that the thanks was never really the point. The point was that the children lived, and grew up, and had lives of their own, whether they remembered her name or not. She said the world needed people willing to do good things quietly, without needing anyone to see it. Margaret thought about those words, long after Louise had driven back down the gravel road toward town. Thought about them as she stood once more at the edge of the tree line that evening, staring into shadows that gave nothing back. She did not know if the pack was gone forever, moved on to some new territory in search of food or safety, or simply resting somewhere deep in the woods, healthy and whole, and no longer in need of the medicine she had faithfully provided for 3 long years. She did not know if she would ever see the Silver Alpha again, ever again feel that strange electric certainty of being watched by something wild and intelligent and, in its own way, grateful. But she decided, standing there in the fading light with Louise's words still echoing in her mind, that she would keep the crate stocked regardless. Not because she expected an answer, not because she needed proof that any of it had mattered, but because the choice to help, the choice to give without guarantee of return, had never truly belonged to the wolves in the first place. It belonged to her, and it was hers to make again and again, for as long as she was able, whether anyone or anything ever came to claim what she offered. It was nearly a month later, on a warm evening in early June, when Margaret finally found what she had been searching for, without daring to admit how desperately she had been searching. She walked to the gray rock as she had every few days throughout that long silent spring, prepared once again to find the crate untouched, and instead found it not merely emptied but tipped carefully onto its side, its contents gone entirely, and beside it, unmistakable in the soft evening light, a fresh paw print far too large to belong to any of the younger wolves. Margaret sank to her knees in the grass beside that print, her hands trembling, tears rising unexpectedly to her eyes, as relief washed through her chest, like something physical, something with weight and warmth. She did not know where the pack had gone during those long, silent weeks, would never know for certain whether they had traveled far in search of food, or hidden from some danger she could not guess at, or simply needed to test, once again, in their own patient and wordless way, whether her devotion could survive a period of silence and doubt. Whatever the reason, they had returned. And Margaret understood, kneeling there in the grass with tears drying on her weathered face, that she had passed another test she had not known she was taking, that the bond between her cabin and the hidden pack in the Coulter woods was not built on convenience after all, but on something far more resilient, something that could survive weeks of silence and still find its way back to the same gray rock at the edge of the same quiet forest. That night, for the first time in over a month, she heard the howls return, distant and rising, carried on the warm summer wind through her open window, and Margaret Doyle lay awake long into the night, listening to that sound, with a joy so pure, it felt almost like grief, grateful beyond words for a connection she could never fully explain, and grateful, too, that whatever tests still lay ahead in the years to come, she had already proven, to herself if to no one else, that she would not give up on it easily. In the weeks after the pack's return, Margaret found herself paying closer attention than ever to every small detail left behind at the gray rock, as though she might, through careful observation alone, begin to piece together the story of where they had gone and why. She noticed new scars on the animals who came to be treated that summer, deeper and more varied than the wounds she had grown used to seeing, injuries that looked less like the accidents of hunting or the bad luck of an old forgotten trap, and more like the marks of conflict, of a struggle against something determined and dangerous. She began to suspect, though she could never confirm it, that the pack had faced a challenge from a rival group during their absence, a territorial dispute perhaps, the kind that sometimes forced one pack to retreat and regroup, far from their usual range before returning, battered but intact, to reclaim what had once been theirs. It would explain the silence. It would explain the deeper wounds. It would explain, too, the particular exhaustion she thought she saw in the eyes of the animals who limped to her fence line, or waited near the rock in the weeks that followed, an exhaustion that went beyond simple injury into something that looked, if she allowed herself the thought, very much like relief at having survived. She treated more wolves that summer than she had in any single season before, sometimes 2 in the same week, each one requiring careful attention to wounds that ranged from simple scrapes to gashes deep enough to worry her, deep enough that she found herself using nearly every antibiotic she had stockpiled over the previous winter. Her savings, already thin from years of steady spending on supplies no one else knew the true purpose of, grew thinner still, and she began, for the first time, to seriously consider what she might do if the money ran out entirely before her devotion did. She thought about selling a small piece of land at the back of her property, land she had never used for anything beyond the occasional walk, and mentioned the idea once to Walter Higgins over coffee, framing it as a simple decision about finances, rather than admitting the true reason behind it. Walter, ever perceptive despite his easy manner, studied her for a long moment before speaking. "This is about the wolves, isn't it?" he said, not quite a question. Margaret did not deny it. "The supplies cost more than I expected they would when I started this. I didn't think it through as carefully as I should have." "You could stop," Walter said gently, though his tone made clear he did not expect her to take the suggestion seriously. "Nobody would think less of you for it. You've done more for those animals than most people would ever consider doing in the first place." Margaret shook her head slowly, watching the steam rise from her cooling coffee. "I know I could stop. That's not the same as being able to." Walter did not press her further on the matter, though he did, without telling her, begin quietly setting aside a portion of his own modest farm income that autumn, unbeknownst to Margaret, in case a day ever came when she truly needed the help and was too proud to ask for it directly. It was the kind of quiet generosity that existed all around Margaret's own quiet generosity, though she would not learn of Walter's private arrangement for several more years, long after it had already saved her from a winter she might not otherwise have survived without difficulty. By the time autumn arrived again, painting the trees around her cabin in deep gold and burnished red, Margaret had settled into a new understanding of her strange and singular purpose in that valley. She was no longer simply a retired veterinarian, living quietly at the edge of a forest. She had become, in her own private accounting of her life, something closer to a guardian, a keeper of an unspoken agreement between herself and a pack of wild animals who would never know her name, never speak a word of thanks, and never once make her feel, in all their silent visits and vanished supplies, that any of it was expected of her, rather than simply, gratefully, received. She stood at her window that autumn evening, watching the last light fade behind the ridge where she had first heard that desperate cry 3 years before, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to feel something close to peace. Whatever trials had tested the bond between her cabin and the pack that summer, whatever silence or conflict had nearly convinced her that all of it had been imagined, she had come through it with her faith intact, and somewhere out in those darkening trees, she believed, the pack had come through it too, wounded but whole, ready to face whatever the coming winter might bring. That winter, the fourth since Margaret had first opened her door to a wounded pup caught in an old forgotten trap, brought with it a new visitor to the Grey Rock, one whose arrival marked a change she would not fully understand until much later. It was a young wolf, smaller and darker than the others, with a distinctive pale patch of fur across one shoulder that made it easy for Margaret to recognize each time it appeared over the following months. Unlike the others, who came only when injured or in clear need of supplies, this young wolf began appearing simply to watch, sitting at a respectful distance from the rock, even when the crate held nothing new, its dark eyes following Margaret's movements with an attentiveness that reminded her, more than anything, of the Silver Alpha's very first visit years before. She began to wonder, watching this young wolf return again and again through the cold months of that winter, whether she was witnessing something like an apprenticeship, whether the pack, in whatever wordless way animals pass down knowledge and behavior from one generation to the next, was teaching this young one about the strange arrangement that existed at the edge of their territory, preparing it to understand, perhaps even to inherit, the fragile trust that had taken years to build. It was a fanciful thought, she knew, the kind of story a lonely woman might invent to fill the silence of a long winter spent mostly alone. But she found comfort in it regardless. Comfort in the idea that whatever she had built with this pack over 4 long years might not end with the current generation, might instead be passed forward, quietly and invisibly, the way so much of what truly mattered in the world tended to be passed forward, without ceremony, without thanks, simply from one careful guardian to the next. 6 years had passed since Margaret Doyle first carried an injured pup into her cabin, and the wooden crate at the edge of the Coulter Woods had become as much a part of the landscape as the gray rock it rested upon, worn smooth at the corners, from years of weather and use. She no longer questioned the rhythm of her days. Wake before dawn, walk to the rock, check the crate, refill what was needed, return home to tend her garden or read by the fire, until evening brought the distant sound of howls carried on the wind. It had become less a task and more a kind of quiet prayer, repeated daily, without any need for the answer to arrive in words. But that year brought a difficulty Margaret had not fully prepared for, one that had nothing to do with wolves or wounds or empty crates, and everything to do with the slow, ordinary betrayal of a body growing older. It began with a persistent ache in her right hip, one she initially dismissed as the natural consequence of years spent kneeling in cold grass and trudging through deep snow. But the ache grew sharper through the spring, until even short walks left her breathless and unsteady, until the trip to the gray rock, once a pleasant morning stroll, became a slow and painful ordeal that left her exhausted for hours afterward. She saw a doctor in town, a careful young woman named Bethany Cole, who examined her thoroughly and delivered the news with the gentle directness Margaret had always appreciated in medical professionals, having spent her own career trying to deliver difficult news to worried farmers with the same balance of honesty and kindness. "Your hip needs to be replaced," Dr. Cole told her plainly. "The joint has worn down significantly, more than I'd expect to see even in someone your age. I suspect years of kneeling and walking on uneven ground haven't helped matters." Margaret absorbed this news with the same steady calm she had once used to deliver difficult diagnoses to her own clients. "How long until I could walk normally again, after the surgery?" "Recovery varies," Dr. Cole said, "but you're looking at several weeks of very limited mobility, at minimum, longer before you'd be comfortable on rough terrain again." Margaret left that appointment with a prescription for pain management and a referral to a surgeon in the larger city 2 hours away, and she spent the entire drive home turning over a single question that had nothing to do with her own recovery, and everything to do with the pack she had faithfully served for 6 years. If she could not walk to the gray rock, who would keep the crate filled? Who would tend the wounds that inevitably appeared each season, the scrapes and gashes and occasional trap injuries that still, even after all these years, sometimes found their way to a young or careless wolf? She considered, briefly and reluctantly, explaining the entire situation to Walter Higgins, asking him to take over her duties during her recovery. But something in her resisted the idea immediately, a protectiveness she did not fully examine at the time, a sense that the bond she had built with this pack was hers alone, built slowly through years of patient trust, and that introducing a stranger, however well-meaning, might unravel something too delicate to easily repair. In the end, she scheduled her surgery for the depths of winter, reasoning that the pack's needs tended to be lower during the coldest months, when injuries from thorns and territorial disputes with rival packs became less frequent, and when a break in her routine, however painful, might do the least damage to whatever fragile trust had taken 6 years to construct. The surgery itself passed without complication, though the weeks that followed tested Margaret's patience more severely than almost anything else in her long and often difficult life. She was confined largely to her bed and a single chair near the fire, her hip wrapped and aching, her mobility reduced to careful, shuffling steps between rooms, with the aid of a walker she despised on principle, even as she depended on it entirely. She watched the tree line from her window each day, unable to make the walk that had become as essential to her as breathing, and felt a particular kind of helplessness she had not experienced since the earliest days after her husband's death, decades before. She worried constantly about the crate sitting empty at the gray rock, about wounds going untreated, about the possibility that her long absence might convince the pack, once again, that this source of help had simply vanished, and that they should stop relying on it altogether. It was during this difficult stretch that Louise Caro, without being asked, began quietly taking over the task Margaret could not perform herself. She arrived one morning with a bag of the same supplies Margaret had purchased from her for years, having finally pieced together enough of the truth to understand exactly what was needed and where, and she made the walk to the gray rock herself, careful and a little nervous, restocking the crate exactly as Margaret had instructed her over the phone the night before. "They didn't come near me," Louise reported that evening, sitting beside Margaret's bed with tea for them both. "I didn't see a single one, though I suppose that's rather the point, isn't it?" Margaret felt a rush of gratitude so strong it brought unexpected tears to her eyes, grateful not only for the help itself, but for the quiet, unquestioning way Louise had offered it, without judgment, without treating the entire arrangement as strange or foolish, simply accepting that her friend needed help continuing something that mattered deeply to her, and providing that help without hesitation. Louise continued making the trip twice a week throughout Margaret's recovery, faithfully restocking the crate through the coldest weeks of that winter, and Margaret found herself, propped up in her chair by the fire with her leg elevated and aching, filled with a complicated mixture of gratitude and worry, hoping desperately that the pack would extend to Louise even a fraction of the trust they had built with Margaret herself over 6 long years. She need not have worried, though she would not fully understand this until weeks later, once her mobility had improved enough to make the walk herself again. When she finally returned to the gray rock on a crisp morning in early spring, moving slowly and carefully with the aid of a cane she had reluctantly accepted from Dr. Cole, she found not only the usual signs of the crate having been used, but something new as well, a small pile of pine cones and dry twigs arranged with what looked almost like deliberate care near the base of the rock, a pattern she had never seen before in all her years of visiting that spot. She stood there for a long time, leaning on her cane, studying the strange little arrangement, and though she could never be certain what it meant, if it meant anything at all beyond the ordinary business of animals moving through a familiar space, she chose to believe it was a kind of welcome, a small and wordless acknowledgement that she had been missed, that her long absence had been noticed and understood, and that whatever bond existed between her cabin and the pack in the trees had survived yet another test, this one born not of silence or conflict, but simply of the slow and inevitable weakening of an aging body, doing everything it could to keep a promise made years before. That spring, as her strength gradually returned, Margaret began to think seriously, for the first time, about what would happen to this arrangement when her body eventually failed her completely, as bodies eventually do. She was not a young woman, and though her recovery from surgery had gone well enough, she understood with the same clear-eyed practicality she had always applied to difficult truths that she would not be able to make this walk forever. The thought troubled her more than she expected, not out of fear for herself, but out of a deep and abiding worry for a pack of animals who depended, in ways they could never fully articulate even to themselves, on a source of help that existed only because one particular woman had chosen, years before, to answer a desperate cry instead of walking away from it. She began, quietly and without telling anyone the true reason, to teach Louise more than simply how to restock a crate. She taught her how to recognize the signs of infection in a wound, how to properly clean and dress an injury on an animal too wild and too wary to be handled directly, how to read the subtle signals of trust and fear in a creature's posture that told you whether it was safe to approach or whether patience, once again, was the only sensible course of action. Louise absorbed this knowledge with the same quiet dedication she had shown in filling Margaret's supply orders for years without ever fully understanding their true purpose, and Margaret found herself, watching her friend learn these careful lessons, feeling something close to relief settle into the aching places her surgery had not quite managed to heal. Whatever happened to her own body in the years ahead, whatever new difficulties age might bring, she now understood that the fragile, precious thing she had built at the edge of the Coulter Woods might, after all, survive beyond her own capacity to tend it alone. It was a comfort she had not expected to find in the middle of what had otherwise been one of the most physically difficult years of her long life, and she carried that comfort with her through the rest of that spring, walking a little further each week, growing a little stronger with each visit to the gray rock, until finally, by the time summer arrived in full, she found herself once again able to make the entire journey unaided, her cane left behind at home, her hip healed enough to carry her, slowly but steadily, back into the quiet and faithful rhythm that had defined the past 6 years of her life, and that she now understood, more clearly than ever before, was worth every difficulty it had cost her to maintain. There was one afternoon that summer, not long after Margaret had fully regained her strength, that stayed with her more vividly than almost any other memory from that difficult year. She had walked to the gray rock as usual, moving with a confidence in her steps that felt almost unfamiliar after so many months of careful, painful shuffling. And as she knelt to check the crate, she heard a soft rustle in the ferns nearby that made her go still. She turned slowly and found herself looking at the young wolf with the pale patch of fur across its shoulder, the same one that had begun appearing simply to watch during the winter years before, now fully grown and carrying itself with a confidence and steadiness that told Margaret this was no longer a young, uncertain animal learning its place in the world. It watched her for a long moment, closer than any wolf besides the silver alpha had ever allowed itself to come, before turning and disappearing back into the ferns without a sound. Margaret remained kneeling by the rock for a while after it left, her heart beating a little faster than the moment probably warranted, turning over in her mind the strange and quiet significance of what had just happened. She could not know for certain, of course, but something about the encounter felt different from all the ones that had come before it. Felt less like the careful transaction of an animal collecting supplies, and more like a genuine, if wordless, act of recognition, one creature acknowledging another after years of careful, patient distance. She walked home that evening with a lightness in her step that had nothing to do with her healing hip, carrying with her the growing certainty that whatever she had built at the edge of the Coulter Woods over 6 long years had become something far more lasting than a simple exchange of medicine for trust. It had become, in its own strange and wordless way, a kind of family, scattered across the boundary between the wild world and her own quiet one, bound together not by blood or language, but by the simple, stubborn fact that she had chosen, again and again, to keep showing up. The winter of the 7th year arrived with a coldness that old-timers in the valley swore they had not seen in 3 decades, and it was during that brutal season that Margaret Doyle came closer to losing everything she had built than at any other point in her long, quiet devotion to the pack in the Coulter Woods. It began with a single sick wolf, found collapsed near the gray rock on a morning so cold that Margaret's breath froze instantly on her scarf the moment she stepped outside. The animal was thin, far thinner than any wolf she had treated before, its ribs visible beneath a coat that should have been thick and full for the season, its eyes clouded with a dullness that spoke of more than simple hunger. Margaret recognized the signs immediately, drawing on decades of veterinary experience that told her, with a certainty that chilled her more than the freezing air around them, that she was looking at the early stages of a serious illness, something spreading through the bloodstream, something that would not respond to bandages or simple antiseptic salve. She treated what she could that morning, administering what antibiotics she had on hand, and carrying extra food closer to where the animal lay, rather than making it travel to the rock itself, and she spent the walk home, turning over an impossible dilemma. If this illness was what she feared it might be, a bacterial infection capable of spreading rapidly through a pack living in close quarters through a hard winter, then a single sick animal might soon become many, and the modest supplies she kept on hand would not be nearly enough to address an outbreak of that scale. Over the following week, her fears proved justified. 3 more wolves appeared near the rock, each showing similar signs: listlessness, thinness, beyond what winter alone could explain, a dullness in the eyes that worried Margaret more than any wound she had treated in 7 years of this quiet work. She recognized, with growing dread, that she was witnessing the beginning of an outbreak that could, if left unchecked, devastate the entire pack she had spent years protecting. She drove into the city that same week, further than she had traveled in years, to a veterinary supply warehouse, where she could purchase the stronger antibiotics and supplements she knew the situation demanded. The cost was significant, more than she had ever spent in a single visit throughout the entire 7 years of this arrangement, and she paid for it by emptying nearly the last of her retirement savings. The money she had once imagined would carry her comfortably through her final years, without a second thought for what it might mean for her own future security. She returned to the valley with a car full of supplies and a determination that bordered on desperation, and for the next several weeks, she made the walk to the gray rock not once but twice daily, sometimes venturing further into the trees than she ever had before, following faint blood trails or listless tracks to wolves too weak to make the journey to the rock themselves. It was during this period that Margaret pushed her own body harder than she had in years, harder perhaps than was entirely wise for a woman of her age, walking for hours through freezing temperatures, kneeling in snow to examine animals too sick to fully trust even the hands that had healed them so many times before, carrying supplies deep into unfamiliar parts of the forest, guided only by instinct and the faint, desperate hope that she was not already too late. She nearly lost herself to that cold more than once. On one particularly brutal afternoon, following a trail deeper into the woods than she had ever ventured, Margaret felt the familiar warning signs of exhaustion and cold beginning to overtake her, her fingers growing numb despite thick gloves, her thinking growing slow and foggy in a way she recognized, with the last clear part of her mind, as dangerous. She sat down heavily against the base of a large pine tree, intending only to rest for a moment, before continuing, and it was there, in the fading light of that freezing afternoon, that she saw the silver alpha for the first time in nearly 4 years. It stood perhaps 20 feet away, older now, its once brilliant coat streaked with more gray than she remembered, its movements slower and more careful than the powerful, confident stride she recalled from that very first foggy morning. It did not approach her. It simply stood there, watching, the same steady and intelligent gaze she remembered so clearly, and Margaret, fighting through the fog of exhaustion settling over her mind, understood somehow that its presence was not a threat but a kind of guidance, a signal that she was not lost, that help of some kind was near, that she needed to move rather than rest in the dangerous cold. She forced herself back to her feet, using the tree trunk for support, and by the time she had steadied herself enough to look again, the silver alpha had vanished back into the trees, leaving no trace beyond a single set of tracks in the snow, to prove she had not simply imagined the entire encounter in her exhausted state. She made her way back to her cabin that evening, more shaken than she had been in years, uncertain whether she had truly seen the alpha or whether cold and exhaustion had conjured a vision born from 7 years of hope and devotion. But whatever the truth of it, the moment gave her the strength to push through the final and most difficult weeks of that outbreak, treating animal after animal with a determination that left her utterly exhausted each night, but unwilling, even for a single day, to abandon the effort while lives still hung in the balance. By the time the worst of the illness had passed, nearly a month after the first sick wolf appeared near the Grey Rock, Margaret had spent almost every remaining dollar of her savings, had lost weight she could not afford to lose from the physical strain of those weeks, and had pushed her aging body to limits she had not tested since her working years decades before. But when the Howells finally returned to the valley on a clear, cold night near the end of that difficult month, rising and falling in a chorus that sounded, to Margaret's exhausted ears, stronger and more numerous than she had heard in years, she understood that whatever she had sacrificed, the pack had survived. She sat by her fire that night, too tired even to feel the full relief that should have accompanied that sound, and thought about how close she had come, during those brutal weeks, to giving everything she had, her savings, her strength, perhaps even her own safety. For creatures who would never know the true cost of what she had done for them, who would never understand the sleepless nights, or the numb fingers, or the terrifying moment of exhaustion against a pine tree in the freezing cold, she did not regret it. Even exhausted and financially depleted in a way that would take years to fully recover from, Margaret Doyle understood, with the same clear certainty that had guided every decision of this long devotion, that she would do it again without hesitation, that the cost of nearly losing everything was smaller, in the end, than the cost of doing nothing at all, while a pack she had come to love in her own quiet way faced a danger she had the power to help them survive. In the weeks that followed, as her own strength slowly returned along with the pack's, Margaret found herself confronting a harder question than any illness or exhaustion had posed. Her savings were nearly gone. The modest sum that had once felt like a comfortable cushion against the uncertainties of old age now amounted to little more than what would cover a few months of ordinary expenses, and she understood, with the same practical clarity she had always applied to difficult truths, that she could not continue spending at the rate that emergency had demanded. She sat at her kitchen table one evening, with her bank statements spread before her, doing the kind of careful accounting she had avoided for months, and allowed herself, for the first time, to feel the full weight of what her devotion had cost her. She was 68 years old, living alone, with a roof that needed repair, and a car that grew less reliable each winter, and she had spent nearly everything she owned on medicine for animals who would never know her name. Walter Higgins found her that way when he stopped by unannounced the following morning, papers still scattered across her table, and though Margaret tried to gather them quickly out of a habit of privacy she had maintained for years, he had already seen enough to understand the shape of her trouble. "You should have told me it had gotten this bad," he said, not unkindly, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I didn't want anyone worrying over decisions I made with my eyes open," Margaret said. Walter was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that held more affection than the pity she had feared. "I've been setting a little aside for a few years now," he finally said. "Not much, but enough to help you through a rough patch. I want you to let me help. Margaret began to protest, the old stubborn pride rising in her chest, but Walter cut her off gently before she could finish. "You've spent 7 years giving everything you have to creatures who can't thank you," he said. "Let somebody who can thank you do something back for once." She accepted his help that day, though it took every ounce of humility she had built over a long and often solitary life to do so. And in the months that followed, as her savings slowly stabilized with Walter's quiet support and her own careful new budgeting, Margaret understood that the devotion she had built at the edge of the Coulter Woods had never truly been a solitary thing after all. It had drawn in Louise, and now Walter, each of them offering their own quiet form of help so that hers could continue. And she found in that realization a comfort that eased some of the exhaustion still lingering in her bones from that terrible winter. A reminder that even the most solitary acts of devotion tend, in time, to gather others around them who recognize something worth protecting. Word travels slowly in a small valley, but it travels eventually, and by the 8th year of Margaret Doyle's quiet devotion to the pack in the Coulter Woods, most of the town had heard some version of her story, twisted and reshaped by the ordinary process of gossip until it barely resembled the truth she lived each day. Some versions painted her as eccentric, a lonely old woman who had replaced human company with wild animals because she could no longer manage relationships with people. Others were less generous, suggesting she had lost some essential part of her judgment, that feeding wolves was reckless at best and dangerous at worst, the kind of behavior that invited tragedy sooner or later. Margaret heard these whispers secondhand, mostly through Louise, who reported them with obvious reluctance, unwilling to burden her friend with cruelty, but unwilling also to let Margaret walk into town, unprepared for the occasional pointed comment or sideways glance. "Let them talk," Margaret said each time, and mostly she meant it. She had built a life, over 68 years, sturdy enough to withstand the opinions of people who understood nothing of what actually happened at the edge of her property each week. But there was one conversation that year that cut deeper than the rest, one she could not simply dismiss with practiced indifference. Her niece, Charlotte, the only remaining family Margaret had left after her husband's death and her own siblings passing years before, drove up from the city for a rare visit that spring, concerned by rumors that had reached her through a mutual acquaintance in town. Charlotte was kind, but direct, a busy professional woman with little patience for what she considered unnecessary risk, and she wasted no time raising the subject once she had settled into Margaret's small guest room. "Aunt Margaret, people are saying you're feeding a pack of wild wolves," Charlotte said over dinner that first evening, her tone carefully measured, but her concern unmistakable. "That you've been doing it for years. Is that true?" Margaret considered lying, considered softening the truth into something more palatable, but she had never been a woman comfortable with dishonesty, especially toward family. "It's true," she said simply. "I've been helping an injured pack since I found a hurt pup years ago. It's become something important to me." Charlotte's concern deepened visibly. "Do you understand how dangerous that is? Wolves aren't pets. They're wild animals. One bad encounter, and you could be seriously hurt, or worse. You're not young anymore. You live alone out here, with no one nearby, if something went wrong." Margaret listened to her niece's worry without interrupting, understanding that it came from genuine love rather than judgment, but she felt something rise in her chest regardless, a protectiveness for the choice she had made, that she had not fully examined until forced to defend it aloud. "I understand the risk better than most people would," Margaret said finally. "I spent 30 years working with animals that could have hurt me if I made a careless mistake. I know how to read a wild creature, how to move around one safely, when to approach and when to hold back. I haven't done this recklessly, Charlotte. I've done it carefully, for 8 years, and it has never once put me in real danger." "But why?" Charlotte pressed, genuine confusion in her voice. "Why spend your savings, your time, your energy, on animals who don't even know your name, who will never thank you, never even acknowledge what you've done for them, beyond taking what you leave?" It was a question Margaret had turned over in her own mind many times through the long years of this devotion, late at night when the fire burned low, and doubt crept in the way it sometimes still did, and she answered her niece as honestly as she had ever answered anyone. "Because they needed help, and I was able to give it," she said. "I don't think everything worth doing in this life has to come back to us in a way we can measure or hold in our hands. I spent my whole career healing animals whose owners paid me, and thanked me, and told me how grateful they were. This is different. This is giving simply because the need exists, without any guarantee of thanks, and I have found, strangely enough, that it means more to me than almost anything I did during all those years of being thanked. Charlotte did not fully understand. Margaret could see that clearly in her niece's still troubled expression, but she did not argue further that evening, choosing instead to let the matter rest, though her worry lingered visibly throughout the remainder of her visit. She left 2 days later, with a promise extracted from Margaret to call regularly, and to consider, at minimum, carrying some kind of emergency device on her walks into the forest. A compromise Margaret accepted readily enough, understanding it as an expression of love, rather than an attempt to change her mind about the devotion itself. After Charlotte's departure, Margaret found herself thinking more seriously than she had in years about the isolation her choice had brought into her life, the family gatherings she rarely attended, the friendships that had grown distant simply because so much of her time and energy poured into a forest most people would never understand her connection to. She was not unhappy, exactly, but she recognized, sitting alone by her fire after Charlotte's car had disappeared down the gravel road, that the life she had built was undeniably a lonely one, built around a devotion that very few people in her life could fully comprehend or share. She thought too about her own health, which had never fully returned to what it had been before the hip surgery 2 years prior, and about the physical toll that 8 years of walking through snow and kneeling in wet grass and pushing her aging body through emergencies like the illness outbreak had clearly taken. She was not young. She would not be able to continue this indefinitely, no matter how much her heart wanted otherwise, and the honest acknowledgement of that fact settled over her that evening with a weight she had been avoiding for longer than she cared to admit. Still, when she walked to the gray rock the following morning and found the crate emptied as usual, evidence that the pack continued on, healthy and resourceful, and utterly unaware of the doubts that had visited her the night before, Margaret felt the familiar certainty return, quieter now, but no less firm. Whatever loneliness her choice had cost her, whatever family worry it had caused, whatever price her own body continued to pay for it, she understood, standing there in the cool morning air with birdsong rising around her, that she would make the same choice again without hesitation, that some devotions were worth their cost, even when no one else could fully understand why. That summer brought a different kind of loss, one Margaret had not anticipated when she woke on an ordinary Tuesday morning to find a message from Louise's daughter waiting on her answering machine. Louise had suffered a stroke overnight, sudden and severe, and had been rushed to the hospital in the city, her condition serious enough that the family had gathered from several states away within hours. Margaret drove to the hospital immediately, sitting for long hours in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, and though Louise survived, the recovery ahead of her was long and uncertain, her speech affected, her right side weakened, in ways that would require months of therapy before anyone could say with confidence how much she would eventually regain. It was a difficult blow in more ways than one. Margaret grieved for her friend with the genuine sorrow of someone who had shared a decade of quiet, unspoken understanding, and she grieved too, in a smaller and more selfish corner of her heart that she was not proud of, for the loss of the one person who had helped carry the burden of her devotion to the pack during her own difficult recovery years before. Louise would not be able to make the walk to the gray rock again for a very long time, if ever, and Margaret understood that whatever safety net she had quietly built around her singular purpose had just grown considerably thinner. She visited Louise every week throughout that summer, sitting beside her hospital bed, and later her bed, at the rehabilitation center, holding her friend's weaker hand and talking softly about ordinary things, the garden, the weather, small-town gossip that Louise, even in her diminished state, still seemed to enjoy hearing. She never mentioned the pack during these visits, sensing somehow that her friend's fragile energy should not be spent worrying over wolves neither of them could do anything about in that moment. But she thought about them constantly during the long drives back to the valley each week, worried in a distant, low-grade way about how she would manage everything alone again, about whether her own aging body could carry the full weight of this devotion, without the quiet support Louise had provided for years. She did not yet have an answer to that worry when autumn arrived, and Louise, still recovering but stronger than the doctors had initially predicted, finally returned home, to a life that would never quite look the same as it had before, and Margaret understood. Watching her old friend adjust slowly to a body that no longer moved the way it once had, that the two of them now shared something neither had expected, a deep and personal understanding of what it meant to keep showing up for something important, even after your body had made that showing up far harder than it used to be. Nothing in the 9th year gave Margaret Doyle any warning of what was coming. No strange silence, no unusual wounds, no sense of foreboding that might have prepared her for the emptiness that eventually settled over the gray rock at the edge of the Coulter Woods. It began, as such things often do, with nothing at all. A quiet spring, milder than usual, with fewer injuries brought to her attention than in any year she could remember. She told herself this was good news, evidence perhaps of a pack grown healthy and cautious enough to avoid the accidents and conflicts that had so often sent a wounded animal limping toward her supplies. She refilled the crate on her usual schedule, found it emptied as expected, and did not think much of the quiet season beyond a passing gratitude that her aging body was being spared the more strenuous demands of previous years. The silence deepened as summer arrived. Weeks passed with the crate untouched, and Margaret, drawing on the hard lesson of the outbreak 2 years before, forced herself to remain calm, rather than immediately assume the worst. Packs moved their territory sometimes, she reminded herself, following prey or avoiding conflict with rivals, exactly as Walter had told her years ago during that first frightening gap in contact. She continued her routine anyway, walking to the rock every few days, out of habit and hope, though the emptiness she found there each time began, despite her best efforts at patience, to settle into something heavier in her chest. By the time autumn's first cold mornings arrived, nearly 4 months had passed without a single sign that the pack still existed anywhere near her land. No tracks, no distant howls at dusk, that sound which had become so essential to her evenings that its absence left her lying awake at night, listening to a silence that felt wrong, in a way she could not fully articulate. No fur caught on branches, no scattered signs of passage through the underbrush she had grown so skilled at reading over 9 long years. Margaret searched the forest herself during this period, more extensively than she ever had before, walking farther from her cabin than her doctor would likely have approved of, following old trails deeper into the Coulter Woods, in search of any evidence that might explain the silence. She found nothing conclusive. An old den site, long abandoned, its entrance partially collapsed and grown over with roots and moss, gave no indication of how recently it had been used. A scattering of bones near a rocky outcrop might have belonged to prey the pack had taken, or might simply have been the ordinary remains left by any of the forest's many predators over many seasons. She drove to the wildlife office in town, more insistent this time than she had been during the shorter silence years before, and spoke at length with a ranger named Diane Farrow, who had recently taken over the region's wolf monitoring program. Diane listened carefully to Margaret's careful, edited description of the situation, though Margaret found herself, even now, reluctant to reveal the full depth of her personal involvement, framing her concern instead as that of a longtime resident who had simply noticed a change in the local wildlife. "There's actually been some regional movement we're tracking," Diane told her, pulling up records on her computer. "A larger pack has been expanding its territory from the eastern ridge over the past year. It's possible a smaller established pack in your area felt pressured to relocate, rather than risk a direct conflict." The explanation offered a kind of comfort, though not enough to fully ease the ache that had settled into Margaret's chest over those long silent months. A relocation, if that was truly what had happened, meant the pack had likely survived, had simply moved beyond the range where her help could reach them. It was, in some ways, a good outcome, evidence of survival instinct working exactly as it should. But it also meant, Margaret understood with a grief she had not expected to feel so sharply, that 9 years of devotion might simply be over, ended not by tragedy, but by the ordinary, uncontrollable drift of wild lives moving beyond the boundaries of a single woman's small and quiet kingdom. She grieved that possibility more deeply than she had expected to, more deeply, if she was honest with herself, than she had grieved almost anything since her husband's death many years before. She found herself standing at her window each evening from long habit, watching a tree line that offered nothing back, and she began, slowly and reluctantly, to imagine a future in which the crate at the gray rock simply sat empty forever, a monument to something that had once mattered enormously, and had now quietly ended without ceremony or explanation. Winter arrived that year heavier and colder than most, and Margaret continued her walks to the rock more out of stubborn ritual than genuine hope, restocking supplies that seemed increasingly likely to sit untouched until they spoiled and needed replacing with fresh stock she could no longer easily afford. Her savings, still recovering slowly from the depletion of the outbreak 2 years before, could not sustain indefinite restocking of supplies, with no evidence anyone remained to use them, and she found herself, for the first time in 9 years, seriously considering whether the time had come to finally let this devotion end, gracefully and on her own terms, rather than continuing a ritual that might have already lost all meaning. She spoke about this possibility only once, to Walter, on a bitter afternoon in the depths of that winter when he had stopped by to help clear snow from her roof, a task her hip no longer allowed her to manage safely alone. "Maybe it's simply over," she told him, watching the gray sky through her kitchen window. 9 years is longer than I ever expected this would last. Maybe I should be grateful for what it gave me, and let it go now, before I spend everything I have left chasing something that isn't there anymore." Walter considered her words carefully before responding, the way he always did when a subject mattered enough to deserve real thought rather than easy reassurance. "You'll know when it's truly over," he finally said. "But I don't think you're there yet, Margaret. I think you're still hoping, and hope isn't the same as knowing something's ended." His words stayed with her through the rest of that difficult winter, a small anchor of patience she returned to whenever the silence outside her window threatened to convince her entirely that all of it was finished. She continued the walks, though she scaled back the frequency of her restocking to conserve what remained of her resources, and she continued, too, the quiet nightly ritual of listening at her window for howls that never came, holding on to a hope that felt, with each passing week, increasingly like stubbornness rather than genuine faith. It was in February, during the coldest week of that entire difficult winter, that Margaret received a piece of news that reshaped her understanding of the silence entirely, though not in the way she had expected. Diane Farrow called her directly, having remembered their earlier conversation, and following up with information she thought Margaret might want to know. "We picked up a collar signal about 11 miles east of the Coulter Woods," Diane told her. "It's from a wolf we tagged years ago as part of a different regional study, but the pack composition around it matches what a colleague described seeing in your area a few years back. Coloring, pack size, that sort of thing. It's not confirmed, but it's possible. This is the same pack you've been asking about." 11 miles was farther than Margaret had ever imagined the pack might travel. Far enough that she understood immediately she would never again be able to reach them on foot. Far enough that whatever role she had played in their survival over the past 9 years had likely, in the most literal and practical sense, come to its natural end. And yet the news brought her an unexpected flood of relief regardless, because it meant they were alive. It meant the silence had not been the tragedy she feared, but simply the ordinary, uncontrollable drift of wild creatures, following food and safety wherever it led them, exactly as Diane had suggested months before. Margaret thanked her for the information, and sat for a long time afterward at her kitchen table, absorbing the strange mixture of grief and relief that news like this inevitably brings. The pack was alive. They no longer needed her, or perhaps more accurately, they had never truly needed her in the singular, essential way her heart had sometimes convinced her they did, and they had simply moved on to a new territory better suited to their continued survival, exactly as any healthy wild pack eventually would. She thought, sitting there with her cooling tea and the wind rattling against her windows, about the 9 years that had led to this moment, the injured pup she had carried home in her own jacket, the silver alpha watching from the fog, the countless wounds treated and supplies given, without a single word of thanks ever exchanged between herself and the creatures she had come to love, in her own quiet, solitary way. She had given everything she reasonably could, and perhaps more than was reasonable by any measure a careful accountant might apply to her finances or her health, and in the end, the pack had simply done what wild things do. They had survived, and moved forward, into a future that no longer included her. It was, she told herself that night, staring into the dying embers of her fire, exactly the ending she should have expected all along. A wild pack was never meant to depend forever on a single aging woman at the edge of a forest. Their survival, their independence, had always been the true measure of success, far more than any continued need for her help could ever have been. She had done her part. She had kept them alive long enough to grow strong enough to move on without her. And yet, sitting alone in her quiet cabin that night, with the crate at the Grey Rock sitting empty 11 miles from wherever the pack now called home, Margaret Doyle allowed herself, for the first time in 9 long years, to simply grieve, fully and without restraint, for the ending of something that had given her own quiet, solitary life more purpose and meaning than almost anything else she had known since losing her husband decades before. She did not know, crying quietly by her dying fire that bitter February night, that this ending was not the ending at all, that somewhere out in that vast eastern territory, a pack she believed had left her behind forever, still remembered, in whatever wordless way wolves remember such things, exactly where the Grey Rock stood, and exactly what debt still remained unpaid. Spring came slowly that year, reluctant to loosen winter's grip on the valley, and Margaret found herself moving through those months with a kind of quiet emptiness she had not experienced since the earliest years after her husband's passing. She still walked to the Grey Rock from time to time, though less often now, and each visit felt less like a ritual of hope, and more like a visit to a place that held only memory rather than purpose. She began, during this period, to fill the space that had once belonged to her devotion to the pack with other things. She spent more time in her garden, expanding it further than she had in years, and she accepted, for the first time in a long while, several invitations to town gatherings she would once have politely declined in favor of an evening watching the tree line. Louise, still recovering her strength but improving steadily, encouraged this shift gently, glad to see her old friend rebuilding a life that did not revolve so entirely around a single, uncertain devotion. Charlotte visited again that spring, relieved to find her aunt seemingly more settled, more willing to discuss ordinary things, and Margaret allowed her niece to believe that the chapter of the wolves had closed peacefully, a story with a natural and acceptable ending, rather than an open wound still aching beneath the surface of her days. But even as she built this new rhythm, Margaret never fully stopped listening at her window in the evenings, never fully stopped scanning the tree line during her garden work for a shape that no longer appeared. Some part of her, quiet and stubborn beneath the calm surface she presented to Louise and Walter and Charlotte, refused to fully accept that 9 years of devotion had simply ended in silence, without a single final moment to mark its close. She told herself this refusal was simply the slow process of grief working its way through her, the same way it had taken years to fully accept her husband's absence from the house they had shared for decades. She did not yet understand that her instinct, however illogical it seemed even to her, was about to be proven right. The knock, if it could be called that, came just after 9 in the evening, on an ordinary night in early autumn, 10 years almost to the week since Margaret Doyle had first heard a desperate cry from the ridge above the creek and run toward it without a single thought for herself. She was sitting by her fire with a book open in her lap, more out of habit than genuine attention, when a sound at her front porch made her go completely still. It was not the wind. It was not the settling creak of old wood that her cabin made on cold nights. It was something deliberate, something with weight and purpose, moving carefully across the wooden planks just beyond her door. Margaret's heart began to race, though not, she would realize later, from fear. Some deeper instinct, built from 10 years of listening for exactly this kind of sound, told her before her conscious mind had fully caught up, that whatever waited on her porch was not an ordinary visitor. She rose slowly from her chair, setting her book aside with hands that had begun to tremble slightly, and crossed to the window beside her door, moving carefully, so as not to startle whatever had come to her home in the darkness. What she saw through the glass, illuminated faintly by the porch light she kept burning through the autumn evenings, stopped her breath entirely. Standing at the edge of her porch, close enough to touch had a wall of glass, and old habit not stood between them, was the silver Alpha, older now than she remembered from their brief encounter 5 years before, its coat more heavily streaked with gray, its powerful frame carrying the visible weight of many hard winters survived. But it was unmistakably the same animal, the same steady and intelligent gaze that had watched her from the fog on that very first morning 10 years before, now fixed directly on her through the window, with an intensity that made Margaret's chest ache with a feeling she could not immediately name. She stood frozen for a long moment, uncertain whether to open the door, uncertain whether this was truly happening or whether 10 years of hope and grief had finally conjured something her exhausted heart desperately wanted to see. But the wolf did not vanish. did not turn and flee back toward the tree line, the way every instinct in its wild nature should have told it to do, when faced with a lit window, and the shape of a human clearly visible behind the glass. It simply stood there, patient and still, waiting. Margaret's hand found the door latch before her mind had fully decided to move it there. She hesitated only once, the old careful caution of 30 years working with animals reminding her, gently but firmly, to think before she acted. But something in the wolf's posture, something she had learned to read over a decade of careful, patient observation, told her clearly that whatever had brought this animal to her door, after so many years of silence and distance, it had not come to cause her harm. She opened the door slowly, the cold night air rushing in around her, and stepped out onto the porch with her heart pounding loud enough that she was certain the wolf must be able to hear it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silver alpha stood exactly where it had been, close enough now that Margaret could see clearly the scars that marked its muzzle and shoulders, evidence of a decade's worth of survival in a world that offered wild creatures no easy comfort. Its eyes, still sharp despite the visible age in the rest of its body, held hers without wavering. Margaret lowered herself slowly onto the top step of her porch, the same careful, unhurried movement she had used 10 years before, when kneeling beside a trapped and frightened pup by a creek she still walked past most weeks of her life. "Hello," she whispered, her voice unsteady, with an emotion she had not fully allowed herself to feel until this exact moment. "I did not think I would see you again." The wolf did not respond in any way. A person watching from a distance would have recognized as meaningful. No bark, no whine, no obvious gesture that translated cleanly into human understanding. But it lowered itself, slowly, and with visible care given its evident age, to lie down on the cold ground at the base of her porch steps, close enough now that Margaret could have reached out and touched it, though she made no move to do so, understanding instinctively that this closeness had not been offered as an invitation for contact, but simply as a presence, a willingness to be near her that had taken 10 years and countless silent visits to fully earn. They stayed like that for what felt to Margaret like a very long time, though she would later be unable to say with any certainty whether it had been minutes or the better part of an hour. She talked softly the entire time, the way she had talked to the injured pup all those years ago, telling the old wolf about the years that had passed, about the outbreak she had fought through, about her hip surgery and Louise's stroke, and the long silence she had believed marked the end of everything they had built together. She did not know if any of it meant anything to the animal lying quietly below her, but the telling of it mattered to her regardless, a decade of unspoken devotion, finally given voice in the cold autumn air. Eventually, as the night grew colder, and Margaret's own aging body began to protest the long stillness of sitting on hard wooden steps, the silver alpha rose slowly to its feet. It looked at her once more, a long and steady gaze that Margaret would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, and then it turned and moved away from the porch, not hurrying, not fleeing, simply walking with the same unhurried dignity it had carried since that very first foggy morning 10 years before, until the darkness beyond her garden swallowed it completely. Margaret sat on her porch for a long while after it had gone, too moved to immediately return inside, staring into the darkness where the wolf had disappeared, and feeling, for the first time in the long silent months since Diane Farrow's call about the collar signal 11 miles east, that whatever bond had grown between herself and this pack over the past decade had not, after all, quietly ended in the ordinary drift of wild lives moving beyond her reach. It had simply been waiting, patiently and across a great distance, for the right moment to return. She did not sleep much that night, her mind turning over the visit again and again, searching for meaning in every detail she could recall. The particular way the wolf had lowered itself to the ground, the steadiness of its gaze, the visible age and scarring that spoke of a decade's worth of hardship, survived somewhere far beyond the boundaries she had once believed defined their entire relationship. She thought about calling Louise or Walter first thing in the morning, to share what had happened, but found herself reluctant to translate the experience into words that might diminish it, worried that speaking of it too soon might somehow break the fragile, precious quality of what she had just witnessed. She rose before dawn instead, as she had for 10 years, and walked, out of an instinct too deep to question, not toward the old gray rock at the edge of her property, which she knew now sat far outside whatever territory the pack currently called home, but simply toward the tree line closest to her cabin, standing there, in the pale gray light of early morning, and searching the shadows for any further sign of the visitor who had come to her the night before. She found nothing beyond a single set of large paw prints pressed into the soft earth near her porch steps. Proof, if she had needed any, beyond the memory still vivid in her mind, that the previous night's encounter had truly happened, that it had not been some vivid and desperate dream, born from years of longing. She knelt beside those prints for a long time in the cold morning air, tracing their outline with her fingers, the way she had once traced a similar print in the snow years before, and allowed herself, finally, to believe with full certainty that whatever debt she had spent a decade quietly building between herself and this remarkable creature, it was not finished yet, that something more remained to be understood, and that she would not have to wait much longer to learn exactly what that something was. She told Louise about the visit 2 days later, unable to keep the experience entirely to herself any longer, and her old friend listened with the same quiet, unquestioning acceptance she had shown a decade before, when Margaret first confessed the full truth of what happened at the Grey Rock. Louise's recovery from her stroke had left her speech slightly slower than it once was, her right hand, still weaker than she would have liked, but her mind remained as sharp and generous as ever. 10 years, Louise said softly, when Margaret finished describing the encounter. 10 years of giving, without ever once being thanked, and now this. I don't think that's an accident, Margaret. I think that old wolf came back because it finally could, not because it suddenly decided to. Margaret turned the thought over carefully, unwilling to let herself hope for too much too quickly, after so many years spent building patience around this particular devotion. Or perhaps it was simply passing through, she said. Perhaps it meant nothing more than curiosity about a place it remembered from long ago. But even as she said the words, she did not fully believe them, and Louise's knowing smile told Margaret that her friend did not believe them either. The wolf did not return the following night, nor the night after that, and Margaret found herself once again caught in the familiar rhythm of watching her tree line each evening, though this time the watching carried a different quality than the anxious searching of the silent years before. This waiting felt patient rather than desperate, hopeful rather than grieving, as though some part of her understood that whatever had brought the silver alpha back to her porch after 5 years of absence had not been a single isolated event, but the beginning of something that would unfold in its own time, at its own pace, exactly the way every meaningful moment of their decade-long connection always had. Nearly 2 weeks passed before the second visit came, this time in the gray light of early evening rather than full darkness, and this time the old wolf did not come alone. Behind it, hanging back at the edge of the tree line with the particular caution of an animal still learning to trust a new place, stood a smaller wolf, its coat a mixture of gray, and the distinctive pale patch across one shoulder that Margaret recognized instantly, even after so many years, as the same young wolf who had once watched her from a careful distance during the coldest winter of her recovery years before. Margaret understood immediately, watching the two of them stand together at the edge of her garden in the fading evening light, that she was witnessing something far more significant than a simple return visit. She was being shown, in whatever wordless way these remarkable creatures had always chosen to communicate with her, the next generation of a bond that had begun a decade before with a single injured pup, and a woman brave enough to run toward a cry for help instead of walking away from it. 3 more weeks passed before Margaret Doyle finally understood the full meaning of what had begun on that cold autumn night on her porch, and when understanding finally arrived, it came not in a single dramatic moment, but in a quiet accumulation of small visits, each one adding another piece to a picture that had taken 10 years to fully assemble. The silver alpha returned 4 more times that autumn, sometimes alone, sometimes with the young pale-shouldered wolf trailing carefully behind, and each visit followed the same unhurried pattern that had marked their first reunion. The old wolf would appear at the edge of her porch or her garden in the fading evening light, would lie down at a respectful distance, and would simply remain there for a while, watching her, allowing itself to be watched in return, before eventually rising and disappearing back into the trees without any gesture that a casual observer might have recognized as affectionate or communicative. But Margaret was not a casual observer. She had spent 30 years of her professional life learning to read the subtle language of animals who could not speak, and she had spent the past decade learning, with far greater patience and attention than her professional training had ever required, the particular and specific language of this one remarkable pack. And what she read, in the steady patience of these repeated visits, in the willingness of an aging wild predator, to lie quietly within arm's reach of a human it had every reason by nature to avoid, was not curiosity, and not accident, but something that felt, unmistakably, like a choice. She began, during this period, to understand something about the entire decade of silence that had come before, something she had never fully considered, during all the years of faithful giving, without any apparent acknowledgement in return. She had always assumed, without quite realizing she was assuming it, that the pack's careful distance, their habit of taking supplies only when unobserved, their refusal to approach closely, even after years of treatment and trust, represented simply the ordinary caution of wild animals, unable or unwilling to form any deeper bond with a human who fed and healed them. But watching the silver alpha now, older and slower, and clearly nearing the natural end of its long and difficult life, choosing deliberately and repeatedly to spend its remaining strength returning to her porch, rather than resting in whatever territory it now called home, Margaret began to understand that the distance had never been the absence of a bond. It had been the bond itself, expressed in the only way a wild creature, bound by instincts 1,000 generations deep, could safely express something as vulnerable as gratitude toward a species that had, throughout most of its history, represented nothing but danger. The pack had never ignored her. They had simply loved her, if that word could rightly be applied to a creature so different from herself, in the only language available to them, a language built entirely of trust, extended carefully across a careful distance, of wounds allowed to be treated by patient hands, of supplies taken and used and never once abused or exploited, beyond what genuine need required. And now, with the silver alpha's strength visibly fading, and its remaining time in the world growing shorter with each passing season, that same careful language had finally found room for one final gesture, a choice, to close the distance at last, not out of desperate need, but simply because it could, because 10 years of proven trust had earned this final closeness, and because some things, even among wild creatures who had no words for gratitude, deserved to be expressed before it became too late to express them at all. Margaret shared this understanding with Louise one evening in late autumn, sitting together in Louise's kitchen, with tea growing cold between them, the same way they had shared so many important conversations over the years of their long friendship. "I think it came to say thank you," Margaret said, her voice thick with an emotion she had been carrying quietly for weeks, not with words, because it doesn't have words the way we do, but with its presence, with choosing to be close to me now, when it never chose that before, even when I was closer to it than I've ever been to almost anyone. Louise reached across the table and took her friend's hand, her grip still slightly weaker on that side since her stroke, but no less firm in its warmth. "I think you're right," she said simply, "and I think you deserve to hear it, even in a language most people would never learn to understand." The final visit came on a cold evening in late November, nearly 2 months after that very first knock on her porch, and Margaret would remember every detail of it for the rest of her life, with a clarity that time never managed to soften. She had been sitting by her fire as usual when she felt, more than heard, a presence near her door, and when she opened it, she found the silver alpha waiting on her porch, exactly as it had that very first night, though its condition had visibly declined in the weeks since their reunion had begun. Its movements were slower now, more labored, its breathing audible in the cold night air, in a way that told Margaret, drawing on decades of professional experience with aging and dying animals, that this creature's remaining time in the world could likely be measured in weeks rather than months or years. She lowered herself onto her porch steps, as she had done each time before, and the old wolf settled slowly onto the ground beside her, closer this time than it had ever come before, close enough that Margaret, moving with the same slow and careful patience that had guided every interaction across their entire decade together, found herself finally, gently, reaching out to rest her hand against the animal's grizzled shoulder. It did not flinch away. It did not growl or tense beneath her touch, the way every instinct in its wild nature might once have demanded. It simply remained still, allowing the contact, its breathing slow and steady beneath her palm, and Margaret felt tears rise unbidden in her eyes, as the full weight of 10 years finally settled over her in that single quiet moment of contact, a decade of unspoken devotion, given voice at last, through nothing more than the simple warmth of a hand, resting gently against fur that had weathered so many hard winters in a wild world that had never once made survival easy. "You didn't have to come back," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You didn't owe me anything. I never did any of it expecting to be paid back." The wolf's dark eyes held hers steadily in the dim porch light, and though Margaret would never claim to fully understand what passed between them in that moment, she felt, with a certainty that went beyond anything she could have explained to Charlotte, or Walter, or even Louise, that some kind of understanding had finally been reached, complete and whole. A decade of quiet giving finally met, in the only way it ever could have been met, by a creature incapable of speech but entirely capable, it turned out, of choosing gratitude, and expressing it in the most vulnerable way its wild nature would allow. They remained like that for a long while, the old wolf's breathing slow and steady beneath her hand, the cold November night settling deeper around them, and Margaret found herself thinking, in that quiet and profound stillness, about every difficult choice the past decade had demanded of her. The savings spent without hesitation. The winters walked through, despite aching joints, and the very real risk of exhaustion in dangerous cold. The doubt endured during long silences that had twice convinced her the entire devotion had ended. The worry carried by family, who could not understand why she gave so much to creatures who could never thank her in any language they recognized. She understood now, sitting on her cold porch steps with her hand resting against the shoulder of a dying wolf, who had chosen, in its final weeks, to spend its remaining strength returning to her one last time, that she had been wrong to ever believe the thanks would never come. It had simply been waiting, patient and wordless, for exactly this moment, for a language built not from words but from presence, from trust finally closed to its smallest possible distance, from a choice made freely by a creature who owed her nothing and gave everything regardless. Eventually, as the night grew colder still, the silver alpha rose slowly to its feet, and Margaret rose with it, her own joints aching from the long stillness of the cold ground. It looked at her one final time, that same steady and intelligent gaze that had first captured her attention on a foggy morning 10 years before, and then it turned, moving slowly and carefully down the porch steps, and made its way toward the tree line, pausing once at the very edge of the shadows to look back at her a final time, before disappearing completely into the darkness beyond her garden. Margaret stood on her porch for a long while after it had gone, tears cold against her cheeks in the winter air, understanding without needing anyone to confirm it, that she had just witnessed something she would carry with her for the rest of her own life, however many years remained to her. She did not know, standing there alone in the darkness with her heart full to breaking, whether she would ever see the silver alpha again, whether this final visit had truly been a farewell in the fullest sense, a creature choosing to spend its last remaining strength closing a decade-long distance before its own time in the world finally ran out. But she understood, with a peace she had not expected to feel so completely, that it did not matter whether this had been a final goodbye, or simply one more visit in a bond that might yet continue a little longer. What mattered was that the thanks had come, finally and unmistakably, after 10 long years of silence that had never once, she now understood, meant what she had feared it meant. The pack had never forgotten her. They had simply been waiting, in their own patient and wordless way, for the right moment to show her everything they had never been able to say. Winter passed quietly after that final visit, and Margaret Doyle found herself, for the first time in 10 years, uncertain what shape her devotion to the pack in the Coulter Woods should now take. She did not see the silver alpha again that season, nor in the months that followed, and though she never received any confirmation of what had become of the old wolf, she understood, drawing on the same clear-eyed practicality that had guided her through every difficult chapter of this long journey, that its final visit to her porch had likely been exactly the farewell it felt like in the moment. She grieved that loss quietly, in her own private way, though the grief carried none of the desperate uncertainty of the long silences that had tested her faith in earlier years. This grief was softer, settled, the kind that comes from knowing an ending had been met with dignity and understanding, rather than left hanging in painful, unanswered silence. Spring brought its own quiet confirmation. The young wolf with the pale patch across its shoulder, no longer young in any meaningful sense but grown fully into a strength and confidence that reminded Margaret unmistakably of the silver alpha in its prime years before, began appearing regularly near her property, sometimes alone, sometimes leading 2 or 3 younger wolves whose careful, curious postures spoke of pups only recently old enough to explore territory beyond their den. Margaret understood. Watching this new leader guide its own small pack toward the edges of her land, that leadership had passed, the way it always must eventually pass among creatures who lived by their own patient laws of succession, and that this new alpha carried with it something the Silver One had passed down across years of careful, wordless teaching, an understanding that the strange cabin at the edge of the forest, and the woman who lived within it, represented not danger but safety, not a threat but a resource to be trusted, respected, and, when the situation called for it, thanked. She began, that spring, filling a new crate at a spot closer to her own porch, no longer needing to make the long walk to the old gray rock that now sat far outside the pack's regular territory. The new alpha and its small growing pack found this new arrangement quickly, adapting to the changed location, with the same careful intelligence she had come to expect from this remarkable family of animals across more than a decade of quiet observation. Louise, fully recovered now, in most of the ways that mattered, though still carrying the small lasting effects of her stroke in her right hand, began joining Margaret on these shorter, easier walks most weeks, the two old friends moving slowly together through the garden and toward the tree line in a companionable silence that needed no words to feel complete. Walter, too, remained a steady presence, checking in regularly, quietly proud in his own understated way of the devotion his neighbor had maintained, across more years than most people could sustain any single purpose. Charlotte visited again that summer, and this time, when she asked about the wolves, Margaret told her the full story, every detail of the final visit, and the quiet hand resting against grizzled fur in the cold November darkness. Her niece listened this time without the anxious concern that had marked their earlier conversation years before, and when Margaret finished, Charlotte sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "I think I finally understand," she said. "I thought you were giving something away for nothing all those years. But you weren't giving it away at all, were you? You were building something. It just took longer than most things do to finally show itself." Margaret smiled at her niece's words, recognizing in them a truth she had spent 10 years slowly discovering for herself, often in moments of doubt and exhaustion when the meaning of her devotion had felt anything but certain. She had built something, patiently, and without any guarantee that it would ever be recognized or returned, something that had cost her savings, and her strength, and, at times, her own safety, and that had given her back, in the end, a fullness of purpose and connection she had not expected to find again after her husband's death had left her alone in a quiet cabin at the edge of a quiet forest so many years before. She continued tending the new crate through that summer and into the following years, her pace slower now, her walks shorter, but her devotion undiminished by the passage of time or the changing of leadership within the pack she had come to think of, in her own private heart, as something very close to family. She watched pups born and grown, watched the pale-shouldered alpha age in its own turn and eventually, years later, pass its own leadership forward to another careful successor, watched the whole quiet cycle of wildlife continue exactly as it always had, generation folding into generation, each one carrying forward, in whatever wordless way such things are carried, the understanding that the cabin at the edge of the Coulter Woods, and the woman who lived within it, deserved trust, deserved patience, and deserved, whenever the moment finally arrived to offer it, genuine and lasting gratitude. Margaret Doyle lived many more years in that quiet cabin, growing old the way all living things eventually do, her hands finally too unsteady in her final seasons to manage even the shortest walks to the crate near her porch. But by then, Louise's own daughter, having grown up hearing the entire remarkable story across countless family dinners, had taken up the quiet task herself, carrying forward a devotion that had begun with a single desperate cry from the ridge above the creek and had grown, across more than a decade, into something far larger and more enduring than any single life could fully contain. On the evening Margaret passed, peacefully in her own bed, with Louise sitting quietly beside her, those who kept watch near the cabin that night would later swear, though no one could ever fully confirm it, that a long and mournful howl rose from somewhere deep within the Coulter Woods, rising and falling through the darkness in a way that felt, to everyone who heard it, less like the ordinary calling of wild animals to each other across the night, and more like something else entirely, something that sounded, if you allowed yourself to believe it, remarkably like a farewell. Whether that howl truly meant what those who heard it wanted to believe it meant, no one could ever say with certainty. But those who had known Margaret Doyle across the many years of her quiet, remarkable devotion understood, without needing any confirmation beyond their own hearts, that she had spent a decade proving something simple and profound about the nature of true kindness, that it does not require witnesses to matter, does not require thanks to be worth giving, and that sometimes, if given patiently and faithfully enough, across enough difficult years, even the wildest and most silent hearts in the world eventually find their own way of saying thank you, in their own time and in their own unmistakable language.